Welcome to the final session of the day. Like I said earlier, my name is Britt and I'll be the room monitor for this session. Dr. Shelby Miller is going to be sharing with us today. She's from uh, Texas A&M, East Texas A&M University, where she is an assistant professor in the Department of Literature and Languages. Her research and teaching focus on the intersection of personality, language education, and multilingual learning, examining how traits like introversion and extroversion influence linguistic production, classroom interaction, and second language acquisition. When reading through her bio, it seemed to me that Dr. Miller has done a little bit of everything in the academic realm, um, like teach, design curricula, mentor students, conduct research, publish, and present at conferences. So we're really excited that she's sharing with us today. Something interesting that Dr. Miller shared with me before the conference is that despite growing up in Colorado and now living in Texas, her family traces back several generations to Archer, Iowa, which I had to look up. It's a small town in northwest Iowa, about 117 people. They have a post office, a public library, two churches, and a county shop. But it was founded by her great 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 grandfather, John Archer, and her grandmother still owns a few hundred acres of land there today. So that's a pretty cool fun fact to have. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Shelby Miller.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. So hi everyone. I am so happy to be here today. And one of the how I'm connected to the University of Northern Iowa is that I have Dr. Hilal Ergel is a professor at your university, and she is in the teaches in the TESOL program. And she is an old colleague of mine from graduate school. So I've been fortunate enough to know all the faculty up in Iowa with you guys. And so I got connected to this opportunity through that. But thank you for coming today. I'm super excited. This session really sits at the intersection of two things that I find genuinely fascinating, which are how personality shapes the way we learn and what we as educators can actually do with that information in our classrooms. And so we're going to specifically talk about multilingual learners, students who are working to acquire a second or additional language, and how one dimension of personality, specifically extroversion and introversion, influences the kinds of strategies those learners naturally reach for. And I think you'll find I was listening to one of the first sessions and I was like, oh, my session sits as a perfect intersection with learning vocabulary too. My goal is for you to leave today with kind of a clearer framework for thinking about this and some concrete usable ideas to bring us back so you can bring back to your teaching. So our agenda today, first, I'm going to give you a quick test, my simplified extroversion introversion test, just so you can kind of conceptualize the difference, give you a quick synopsis and background on what EI, extroversion and introversion are. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about how it intersects with the framework for language learning strategies. So that's what we're going to be doing today. What you have on your Zoom toolbar is like a reaction section where you can select an emoji of some sort, some type of reaction. You should have one that's kind of like clapping and one that's kind of like hearts. So you're going to use that for a minute if you want to participate to kind of indicate your preference. So I'm going to give you a scenario, and you'll choose which one you think you are most of the time, and that's kind of the wording we want there, and you'll show us your choice based on what reaction you select. So the first part of the test, do you prefer to work by yourself most of the time or work in groups most of the time? And I can only see a handful of you, but I'm definitely seeing a lot more clapping. Let me change my mode. Yes, good. Let's try another one. So kind of mentally keep track of which one you think you're selecting more. This next one, do you tend to think to yourself when you have an idea you want to work on, or do you like to think out loud about that idea, maybe to yourself, but also with other people? Seeing a good mix of clapping and hearts. Our next question, do you tend to wait for others to introduce themselves, or frequently find yourselves maybe being the first person to introduce yourself? Where do you find your comfort, I guess, is mostly what I'm asking here. Forgot to advance the slide for you. There you go. Let's try another one. Are you comfortable walking up to someone you find interesting? And because you find them interesting, you're like, okay, I'm going to go have a conversation with them, or no, not this at all. Please don't. So what we were working through very quickly and very, let me tell you, I have not tested those questions in terms of whether or not the assessment I gave you was a reliable and valid one. We were just playing with scenario differences that typically describe the difference between introverts and extroverts. And if you notice, I do spell extrovert with an A because that is actually the correct spelling for that word, extroversion or extrovert with an A. And it's funny historically because someone at some point misspelled it with an O, and that's the version that really took off. So if you see that, it's not a misspelling on my end, it's actually the classical way to spell it. So let's just take a few minutes to talk through the foundation of personality because the rest of the session really hinges on having a reworking of this idea. When we hear most people, when people hear extrovert or introvert, they think about how social someone is generally, but that's actually just a manifestation, an observable byproduct, not really what extroversion and introversion are in themselves. The more useful distinction, and the one that really actually explains why learners make the choices they make, is about energy. So extroverts are energized by engaging outwardly with the world around them. So if you put a stimulus in front of an extrovert, that could be a person, that could be a new idea, that could be a problem to solve, it could be a puzzle, it could be a roller coaster. And their natural impulse more often than not is to react externally to it. So to do the puzzle, to get on the roller coaster, to talk, to ask, to try. And that outward engagement is where their psychological energy comes from. Introverts are energized alternatively by turning inward in response to the same world, right? So the same stimulus, just different instinct. Observe first, process internally, then respond if they respond externally at all. And their energy comes from that internal engagement, not from the outward reaction. So we see, we think things like we see things like extroverts being talkative or introverts preferring to work alone. And we want to be clear that those are really just byproducts of what's happening on the inside. What their internal drive is. So the internal drive underneath it is what really matters to us when we talk about personality. And I'm going to go on a quick side note real quick. The reason why we want to pay attention to the fact psychologically and what's happening on the inside is because a lot of times introverts get described as you watch an introvert and people describe them as withdrawn, reserved, sometimes shy, sometimes anxious socially. And we have to be very careful because just because you can see something on the outside, that's not what's psychologically driving it. Because being reserved, shy, anxious socially, those are also manifestations that describe personality traits of shyness and anxiety. And those are different different concepts completely from introversion. So I didn't make a slide on this, but there's one thing I could hound into you today is that introversion is very different from shyness and anxiety. Can an introvert be shy and have anxiety? Absolutely. And there's also research to show that extroverts do as well. So we want to kind of differentiate those, and we want to be paying attention to what's the psychology happening underneath. So the distinction matters enormously for language learners because the classroom is full of stimuli, right? Input, tasks, peers, pressure to produce, and introverts and extroverts are going to respond to all of it differently and for fundamentally different reasons. It's not preference or attitude, it's where their energy naturally flows. So on the screen here are just some quick examples of how that internal drive, how that energy manifests outwardly when we look at the difference between extroverts and introverts. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is that these things that we're describing extroverts and introverts as, these are tendencies on a continuum. Extrovert and introvert are not clearly defined boxes. And no, I am against the notion of an ambivert, and here's why. I get what it's trying to, and there's also some new terms out there. I get what it's trying to say. The reality is people lean one direction most of the time. And it doesn't have to be an extreme leaning, but you have a direction that you're leaning most of the time. And so when we think about something like handwriting, right? Everyone's got a dominant hand. You have one that you lean to, a hand that you lean on most of the time to do the writing, but you could use the other hand. It's just not comfortable. It's just not as precise. It's not as exercised, but it is available to you. So absolutely, you could be fluctuating on this continuum, but by and large, research is showing you lean towards the side more often than not. You might not be as extroverted as another extrovert or as introverted as another introvert, but we're looking at, when we talk about these two terms, we're looking at where does a student lean most of the time. So that's a quick synopsis of it. I have a whole chapter I'm happy to email you after this, really diving into the difference of the two if you want more of that theoretical and applied background. But with that in place, I want to talk about the tools learners use to engage with all of that, to engage with language learning strategies. Now, I'm guessing you might be familiar with this, but in case you're not, answering the question, what are language learning strategies? So Oxford and Scarcella define these as specific actions, behaviors, and steps or techniques employed by students to enhance their own learning. And they're described as activities consciously selected by learners to regulate their own language learning. And Oxford herself called them, and this is a striking claim, the most important variable influencing performance in a second language. So now, whether or not you fully agree with that ranking, the point stands that strategies matter. And they are the tools learners use to engage with language, manage their learning, and push through difficulty, right? And because they're consciously selected, they're teachable. And that's what makes this so relevant for us as educators, is that they are things that you can teach them. So pardon me, before we go any further, let's anchor in 3 important points that will kind of frame everything that follows. First, language learning strategies are not innate abilities, they're learned skills. They develop over time. They need practice, they need awareness. And this means that no learner is locked into a fixed set of strategies. They can grow with their repertoire. Second, learners naturally do gravitate towards strategies that align with their personality traits. So Oxford established this in 1989, and it's been replicated consistently since. This doesn't mean they only use those strategies, but it means those are the ones they tend to feel intuitive and energized, keyword energy, about rather than them feeling effortful and draining. And third, this comes back to you teachers again, explicit instruction matters. So when learners are taught how to use strategies, especially when they're taught on strategies that match their personality, they show stronger outcomes. So for example, one study in 2022 found that introverted learners who receive tailored instruction in metacognitive strategies significantly improved their listening comprehension, and not the same outcome with extroversion. And so these strategies were working anyways, but instruction for introverts actually amplified that. So let's look at the 6 learning strategies, and we're going to go through each of these again. So if you want to quickly take a screenshot so you have this as a guide, I meant to provide it for you in the chat myself, but I didn't pull it up in the effort of trying to get on Zoom so quickly. So Oxford taxonomy is the most comprehensive and most used framework in research on personality and language learning in general, which is why we're going to use it here. And there are 6 strategy types, okay? And those are memory related. And these memory-related strategies help learners store and retrieve language by forming associations, using imagery, organizing information. You could think things like mnemonics, or visualizing a word in a scene, grouping vocabulary into categories. And there's a lot of different examples of those. These are just some I'm coming up with for us here to conceptualize it. We've got cognitive strategies. These help learners directly process and manipulate language. So things like analyzing patterns, taking notes, using a grammar rule in a new sentence to understand it, right? Summarizing text, and these are considered cognitive strategies. Compensatory strategies, these kick in when learners have a gap in their knowledge but want to keep communicating. So things like guessing from context, paraphrasing, using gesture, or selecting an alternative wording. This might be where you see some code switching, right? And these let learners keep going even when they don't know the exact word or structure. Then we have metacognitive strategies. These are about self-regulation, planning your learning, monitoring your comprehension, evaluating your progress. So you'll see this manifest as things like setting goals, checking for errors, reflecting after a task. Two more to go. Affective strategies. These help learners manage their emotional, or I guess their emotions and their motivation. So things like asking questions, seeking help, practicing with peers or more proficient speakers, and negotiating meaning. And then, I blurred my thoughts on two. Sorry, effective strategies. As I was saying it, I was like, that doesn't sound like effective. Effective strategies are how that manifests would be like positive self-talk, breathing exercises, creating low stress environments. So maybe they know what study conditions they prefer to be in to effectively study, and things like managing frustration. What I was blending together for you was social strategies. And those involve learning through interaction, asking questions, seeking help, practicing with peers or proficient speakers, and negotiating meaning. So these are the 6 categories, and each one plays a different role in the language learning process. And as we will see, learners don't use them equally. So a quick methodology note I like to make before we get into the research findings, because I think it helps explain why we know what I'm about to say. So Oxford developed a companion assessment to her taxonomy called the Strategic Inventory for Language Learning, known as SIL. And it's a self-report questionnaire that lets learners identify their typical strategy use across the 6 categories. And because personality traits and strategy use can be measured using standardized tools, right? You can give your students a personality assessment as well. Researchers then give learners the SIL alongside a personality measure and then directly compare their patterns. That's become the common methodology for basically finding what I'm about to show you. And I think what's interesting though is if you're interested in using SIL with your own students, you can find the full assessment with administration instructions and scoring guides in Oxford's 1990 book called Language Learning Strategies, What Every Teacher Should Know. And there are also informal versions floating around online. People have made alternative versions of it, and you can Google it and find it for free. But if you want results that are comparable to the research base, you should go to the original source. It's kind of the Bible of SIL. So let's look at the research. And I want to start from a distance, what I'm calling zooming out, so we can get the big picture before we start looking into the details. And so when we look across studies that examine the relationship between extroversion and introversion and strategy use, there's some very clear patterns that emerge. And this specifically, what we're looking at here is specifically when research posed the question, which personality trait is associated with which learning style? So if I'm going to compare extroverts and introverts with memory related, who's going to use it more? And we find that extroverts do. And so when we do our zoom in a second, we're going to also look at, an introvert will use a bit of memory related strategies, but not a ton. So it's not like when you see 0 there, they never use it, but they barely use any of it. So we'll get into the nuance when we zoom in, but by and large, I think this zoom out section tells us a lot. And I think the most striking finding is that extroversion appears across all 6 categories. And across the literature, extrovert learners show up in studies associated with like memory related, cognitive, compensatory, metacognitive, affective, and social strategies, right? They use all of them. And this aligns actually really well with what we know about extroversion more broadly, which is that extroverts tend to prefer really varied, dynamic, interactive learning experiences. They really tend to avoid routine or things that feel repetitive or monotonous. So they use a wide range of strategies to kind of fit that orientation towards novelty that they have. Introverts, by contrast, tend to cluster around cognitive and metacognitive strategies. And these strategies, as we described a minute ago, they actually really reward internal processing, things like reflection and planning and depth, all things that align with the introvert's internal drive. 2 strategy categories that stand out for what we don't see with introverts, memory-related strategies and social strategies. let's tie that into introversion for a second. So introverts are notably less associated with both of these. For memory strategies, it's not that they can't use them. This is kind of what I said earlier. It's that surface level encoding techniques and things like rapid retrieval tasks, which is part of what memory related is. These tend to sit less comfortably with introverts' preferences because they have a preference for depth oriented learning. For social strategies, well, that probably isn't a surprise to anyone in the room. We see an alignment there. Even if you have a basic understanding of extroversion, introversion, we can see where extroverts would maybe more align with that. But we will find a way in which introverts do align with social strategies, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But one more thing worth noting, cognitive and metacognitive strategies show substantial overlap between introverts and extroverts. Both groups use them, but they use them differently, and that's why we really need to zoom in. So what I'm going to do for the next 6 slides is we're going to go strategy by strategy, and so it might feel a little monotonous. Sorry, extroverts. I think it was the best way to lay it out. So what I'll do with each is we're going to cover extroverts, introverts, like what we know about each of those with those strategies on a zoomed in level. And then also you'll see the icon for your classroom, like what are takeaways where you could apply some of these concepts literally next hour if you have to go back to teaching. So we're going to start with memory related strategies. Now, extroverts generally show a stronger overall preference for these strategies. They're more likely to use visualization and imagery techniques, like picturing a vocabulary word as an example. And they frequently combine memory strategies with interaction. So remember, they're high in social strategies too. So discussing vocabulary, quizzing peers, rehearsing out loud with partners, right? And you're going to see that the social strategy really infuses with all the other strategies they use. So research also suggests that extroverts tend to have greater short-term memory capacity than introverts and perform better on tasks that required rapidly holding and manipulating information. So that study out of neuroscience that we're bringing into understanding this right here. And this appears linked to the higher cognitive flexibility, which makes strategies involving quick associations, memory-related strategies, feel more natural and effective for them. Introverts, they also use aspects of memory-related strategies, particularly things like quiet rehearsal and private repetition, but they use this category less frequently than some of the other categories. And the reason, I think, comes back to the depth question. Introverts' cognitive style values depth over breadth of information. So they prefer to focus on a smaller number of items and process them thoroughly. Memory strategies can support that, but cognitive strategies, as we'll explore in a second, tend to align even more naturally with how introverts like to engage. And I hope you're seeing yourself in some of this information, whether you're a language learner or not. I think a lot of this scholarship overlaps with just the learning process in general, though I'm pulling it from SLA literature. So in terms of what you do in your classroom, for extroverts, design opportunities to pair memory work with interaction. So again, storytelling activities, peer quizzing, verbal rehearsal, collaborative vocabulary tasks. And for introverts, offer access to quieter self-paced strategies that promote deeper processing. So imagery work, elaboration tasks, grouping and categorization tasks, personalized mnemonics was something that frequently occurred with introversion, and structured rehearsal. Let's move on to cognitive strategies. Now we found when we looked at that last slide with the chalkboard, both introverts and extroverts use these, but they also, again, notably use them in different ways. So for introverts, this was one of their more preferred strategy types. They favor strategies that can be done independently. Summarizing, deducing grammar rules, analyzing patterns, practicing with examples. So they gravitate towards structured formal materials like textbooks, grammar exercises, note-taking, worksheets, and like recorded materials. And these types of materials give them time to think before they have to produce anything, which is important for how the introvert tends to process. And they also engage with things like reading and rereading for form, things like analyzing sentence structures, practicing pronunciation with recordings. Notice with recordings, not with others, and building internal models for how the language works. Extroverts also use a wide range of cognitive strategies, but they do so like in a more flexible and, as you imagined, interactive way. So they might analyze patterns during a conversation, draw unknown structures to improvise new sentences on the fly as they're speaking, right? Or maybe use a dictionary in real time during a task. So they combine things like imagery, note taking, grouping, and contextualization with social practice across listening, speaking, and reading, right? Their cognitive strategy use really reflects their preference for thinking through language while engaging with others, processing again externally rather than internally. I hope I don't sound like a broken record, but you're probably going to hear that again. So in your classroom, what the strategies suggest this way are that for extroverts, design collaborative problem solving tasks, real-time pattern noticing during conversation activities, group tasks, group reasoning tasks. If you're doing work with reference tools like dictionary, making that paired work. For introverts, offering guided analysis worksheets, independent pattern finding activities, recordings or books, things they can practice pronunciation with that might be more computer AI based rather than peer based. Just opportunities and also opportunities to do written reasoning before they're asked to speak. We can't rule out speaking, but we can give them the written time to write first before speaking. Compensatory strategies. These are the ones learners use when they hit like a gap in knowledge, but want to keep communicating. And extroverts use these slightly more overall. They do so primarily, of course, in social and oral contexts. So guessing meaning and paraphrasing on the spot, improvising, using hand gestures. I'm doing that now as a speaker. And they feel more natural for extroverts because they enjoy processing ideas externally, right? And they're typically are really strong at drawing on contextual cues, like a linguistic intuition, social feedback, and you have to keep in mind an extrovert has likely practiced that a lot, even in their first language, right? So now this is unrelated to this presentation. I have another presentation though on how extroversion and introversion relate to the four skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking, but also the linguistic forms like, phonology, morphology, where do we see parallels there? And we do find that extroverts tend to grasp pragmatics a little quicker than introverts do, especially politeness and hedging and things like that. So anyways, they'll ask, extroverts are more likely to ask a peer what something means, or energized by inferring from what's happening in the conversation. They're also known as risk takers, and that could be in the sense of maybe an extrovert's more likely to get on the roller coaster than an introvert. That's not a study I've looked at. I don't know if anybody knows, but socially they tend to be more risk-taking oriented. So they're more comfortable making an attempt, even in producing language when they're not sure about it. Now, introverts tend to use these strategies also, but in solitary or self-directed contexts. So especially when reading, writing, or working independently, they're very careful observers and really good with deductive reasoning, which makes strategies like using context clues or guessing from text or selecting the word is precise, alternative phrasing, or even self-correcting. This is really effective for them based on their thinking style. So in conversation, introverts often pause to ensure an accurate understanding before responding. But when they're uncertain, they actually may avoid communication altogether. And we find that also in first language use. So we know from first language, like individuals who speak English as a first language, they're more likely to be very careful with what they're going to say so that it's precise rather than abstract or inaccurate compared to an extrovert. So we're seeing it's kind of like a transfer effect. This transfers to language learning as well. So they may avoid communication if they're really uncertain, and that's really important to hold into account. Avoidance of communication isn't always disengagement. it can be a compensatory response, right? So I know, especially here in the United States, our culture tends to see students who are talkative and responsive in the classroom as the engaged students, right? But I know many of my teachers statistically are introverts. So remember that your student counterpart is likely quiet and observing, and that's the sign of engagement. So for the classroom setting, extroverts thrive in role plays, as you can imagine, paraphrasing games, collaborative problem solving, and some improvising. Now, again, extroversion is a spectrum. I'm very much an extrovert, but even some of the things I just described, I'm like, please don't give me improvisational tasks, right? Introverts benefit from, again, written exercises or written paragraphs, tasks, meaning searching activities, independent correction practice. And what I want to emphasize here is that when I'm listing these things for your classroom, I'm listing things that are that make it a comfortable strategy for them. Like, the objective, you've got a linguistic objective or, a set of vocabulary terms that you want them to know. The objective is that they learn them. As long as the objective isn't immediately, I need you to be able to turn around and use them in a conversation, which is the objective in the end, right? But if the first goal is, hey, I need you to be familiar with these, we can use language learning strategies, the ones they're energized by, to help them with that familiarity with these terms as we encourage them to be willing to communicate with them. We're going to move on to metacognitive strategies. So this is things like planning your learning, being able to monitor your learning, evaluating. And this is one of the most interesting categories because both groups use it, but they kind of use it in opposite ways. So for introverts, this is one of their most preferred strategy types alongside cognitive strategies. Introverts excel again at the reflective, self-directed metacognition, right? So they plan their study time, they set personal goals, they self-monitor, and they self-evaluate, particularly in reading and writing tasks, or especially in those. And they're comfortable with sitting with their own thinking, checking themselves and adjusting. And these strategies really do fit their preference for structured and predictable learning environments and quiet learning environments. Now, with extroverts, they use metacognitive strategies too, but they're kind of in an outward-facing interactive way. They're more likely to plan practice opportunities with others, monitor their progress during communicative activities. Part of how they monitor their progress is seeking feedback from peers or teachers, like, how'd I do, right? They also use a lot of self-evaluation tools to adjust in real time. So one interesting finding is that the extroverts responded really well to self-evaluation questionnaires and reflective tools, things like personality test or like the SIL inventory, that those tend to be really helpful in their metacognitive process in terms of processing how they're doing or where they stand or where their weaknesses might fall. So in your classroom, sound like a broken record here. Maybe my mouth is just dry. For extroverts, we're thinking about building in interactive planning and reflection opportunities. So the things that come with planning and checking in on our skills, building those into a collaborative thing that could be partner goal setting, that could be peer feedback opportunities, or things like think alouds during communicative tasks. Collaborative progress check-ins. So maybe like, mentorship, whether mentorship opportunities or what's the word I'm thinking of? You have an accountability partner essentially in class. For introverts, we often see like things that offered tools that work better for them are like structured individual tools like goal setting sheets, progress trackers, reflective journals, self-evaluation checklist. Those are the things that are really going to support them or energize them with the metacognitive strategies. And both these are things learners will genuinely use if they're given the time and space to incorporate them in the classroom. We got two more left. We're going to talk about affective strategies. So how we manage emotions, motivation, and anxiety. And across the research, extroverts are frequently associated with affective strategy use. And while they do use internal strategies like positive self-talk, They actually largely rely on, as you could guess, external strategies. So, adjusting their environment through other people. Collaborative tasks, peer feedback, group activities, these are how many extroverted learners manage their stress and build their confidence. They're drawing energy and motivation from the feedback and the interactions. So it makes sense that their emotional regulation strategies would work through connection with others. Introverts actually use less effective strategies, far less often. And when they do, it tends to be in very specific contexts. So, like motivating themselves to take a communicative risk, to initiate or maintain a conversation. You can see that there's an affective process gearing them up for that risk. So they can access like other learning activities they'd otherwise avoid. And that's a meaningful use, right? So, but I think what we want to get at is their effective strategies tend to be internal. So like calming routines, private self-encouragement, again, structured practice. You can see where this layers back to some of the other strategies. They also manage emotions indirectly by adjusting their physical environment. So things like listening to music, using music to create a low stress study space. And interestingly, that kind of environment adjustment also involves metacognitive strategy use. So they're planning conditions to support their focus. Now, in the classroom perspective, for extroverts, obviously building in social-oriented affective support. So we just talked a minute ago about peer accountability, but peer encouragement routines, partner warm-up conversations, group confidence building activities. And then for introverts, providing that quiet, individualized options like personal affirmations, having them think through what their calming routines are and articulating those in written form, giving them private reflection prompts. And this is crucial because preparation time before speaking tasks and giving the introvert, especially that preparation time before speaking tasks, is really crucial to them being able to move into the speaking task. So let's move into the social strategies. And here the pattern is about as clear as it's going to get in the research. Okay, so extroverts use social strategies. I can't even say the word social strategies far more frequently and way more comfortably than introverts. So things like asking questions, cooperating with peers, seeking help, initiating conversations, participating in group activities, and let's say willingness to participate in group activities. And these patterns are documented like study after study, right? I think I cited 11 of them in the tally marks at the beginning. So for extroverted learners, these strategies reduce, inhibition, and it actually sustains their oral confidence. And they are in many ways the natural expression of extroversion in a learning environment. So introverts report very low use of social strategies across contexts. So many prefer solitary work or avoid peer-based interaction unless it's necessary. Again, let's differentiate the avoidance from, oh, they're fearful of it or they have anxiety about it. It's about energy, right? They can. And of course, in language learning, speaking and social strategies are something that we have to engender in the students. But we're talking about energy, right? It's not an energy fueling experience. So what we do find is that when they do use social strategies, they tend to choose really low pressure structured interactions. And importantly, they tend to prefer interacting with teachers or more proficient speakers rather than with peers. And that really matters for how we design interaction opportunities, right? So that's something to consider. It's not that you can be available one-on-one for every introvert every time they want to interact with you, but we're finding that that's when they tend to be more risk-taking in the social aspect. So in your classroom for extroverts, I think I've already said all this, but integrate frequent interactive learning opportunities, any peer work or cooperative tasks, things like role plays, feedback circles, small group problem solving, that's something that they tend to be pretty receptive to, right? Introverts, and this is what I want to emphasize, remember that they are comfortable and often highly motivated in one-on-one settings or small groups with familiar people. Very predictable, low pressure interaction routines are really key here. So we're not avoiding social opportunities and social strategies. What we're doing is providing predictable pair work, teacher-led conferences, rehearsed dialogues, and opportunities to work with like self-selected or familiar partners throughout the semester or the school year. And this is really where it becomes key. If we could go back to the research on introversion, people often think extroverts love people and introverts hate people. I'm being very exaggerative for a reason. I obviously don't agree with any of that. I'm talking general psychology. Extroverts just love everyone, or they're friendly. They have lots of friends. And then they haphazardly describe maybe introverts as really recluse. Really, what introversion is I love friends and I want very few of them so I can have really deep, meaningful relationships with them. And so when we talk about social interaction in the classroom, and if that's something you really want the introvert to be able to be in an environment where they're going to be social, you can support them best by letting them choose who they want to partner with for the year and letting them stick with that partner. I realize that in our American culture, we're very big on pick a new partner, try someone you haven't met before. As an extrovert, I even dislike that, right? So we're monitoring that. Um, yeah, so that's what we're thinking there is you can build in social strategy, social opportunities, but we can do so with advanced notice and working with pairs people that they have frequently worked with. We just got a couple more slides and then we'll go into some wrap up here. So both introverts and extroverts use all six strategies. They just tend to favor certain ones, and then they tend to use the same strategies in different ways. What becomes clear is that strategy use is deeply shaped by their internal drive, right? So for extroverts, even strategies that could be done independently, cognitive strategies, metacognitive strategies, they're really entwined with their preference for interaction. And they bring social engagement to almost everything they're doing. For introverts, strategies tend to align with their preference for deep thinking or reflection or solitary work. They bring that structure and that internal processing to everything they're doing. And we also see that strategies rarely operate in isolation. So extroverts combine social strategies with their approach to all the other categories, and introverts frequently integrate the metacognitive strategies with cognitive and compensatory strategies. So strategy use is more like a web than it is a checklist. One of the most useful insights from the research, and this comes from a 2013 study, is that in the study, their descriptions of learner strategy use, they described learners' use of strategies as chameleon-like. So their point is that strategy use isn't fixed. It shifts depending on the task and the context. So specifically, their research shows that when a task aligns with a learner's personality, learners tend to expand their strategy use. Extroverts employed a wider variety of strategies during speaking and listening tasks where interaction is possible, while introverts used more strategies during reading and writing tasks where they could work independently. So rather than narrowing down to a smaller set of strategies when the task fits, learners seem to fully engage and go all in with more strategies when they like the task, whether it's speaking and listening or reading and writing. And this leads to a simple but important instructional implication. If you're introducing a new strategy or trying to help a learner adopt one for the first time, start with a task that already fits their natural preferences. For extroverts, embed the strategy into a collaborative or talk-heavy activity. For introverts, use a structured self-paced task that allows quiet processing. So starting in a context that suits the learner increases the likelihood they'll actually engage with and adopt the strategy. And you can always expand from there. Designing for both learners. There we go. I was seeing how many slides I had left compared to the amount of time left. So what does all this look like in practice? And there are 4 principles I'd like to offer. First, offer multiple entry points. Not every activity needs to be fully individual or fully collaborative. When you build in options, like a quiet writing entry followed by a structured discussion, for example. You're creating space for both kinds of learners to engage on their terms. Second, build in both quiet processing time and structured interaction within the same lesson. So these don't have to be in competition with each other. Like a think, write, pair, share kind of structure, for example, kind of honors both because we have think, pair, share, think, write, share. But adding in the writing component helps the introvert with the sharing component, right? Third, introduce strategies and low threat contexts that match learners' traits first. So don't ask an introvert to practice a new compensatory strategy in an unrehearsed speaking task that's on the fly, right? Give them written context first. Once that strategy feels familiar, you can expand it into like, hey, let's try it in speech. And fourth, make strategy use visible and teachable. Don't assume the learner will discover these tools on their own. Name the strategies, talk about them. Research is very clear that explicit instruction, especially when it's tailored to the learner's trait, produces stronger outcomes. Just some questions to think about, and then I'll wrap up. But oh, we don't have to discuss them right now, but just take away and think about your own context. Which strategies are you already teaching explicitly? It may be more than you think, or you may find there are entire categories you've never named out loud. Which learners might be underserved by your current classroom structure. So if most of your interaction opportunities are spontaneous and peer-based, who is that designed for, right? And what is one small adjustment you can make to create more flexible entry points? It doesn't have to be a complete redesign, right? One predictable, low pressure structure or like one quiet option alongside the interactive one. And so my takeaway, I'm just going to close with this framing because I think it matters most based on everything we've talked about today. The goal of this work is not to match learners to a fixed set of strategies based on their personality type. So it's not about putting students in a box. The goal is to notice patterns, to understand why certain strategies feel energizing for some learners, but exhausting for others. Like having someone just study the vocabulary, rewrite it 10 times, why that might exhaust a certain personality type. But we want to create more options. Well, we don't necessarily need to create more options. We just want to create more entry points, a little more flexibility. So when learners find strategies that align with their internal drive rather than fight against them because the strategy fights against that internal drive, learners tend to feel less like learning tends to feel less like a struggle and more like a fit. And our job in part amongst the many, I'm sure you're tired of people saying, and our job is this, because we have lots of jobs, I get it. One of our jobs is to help them find that fit and to design classrooms that make it possible for learners to do so. So I want to thank you guys so much for your time today and coming. Now I'll give some more context. This is actually based on a chapter in a book I have coming out next year called Extroversion and Introversion, what every language teacher needs to know. This is just one chapter. We've got other chapters on the role of you as a teacher in terms of whether you're an extrovert or introvert and how that has implications in the classroom with language learning, the role of speaking, reading, and listening. And there's some other chapters. I don't want to take up the time in case there's questions, but thank you guys so much.